And as always, thank you everybody for coming along. I know it's a Friday. I know it's also end of semester here in the UK and in the States and in places. But this is going to be an interesting session because it really does come from sort of practitioners and practitioner educators. So we're right at the coalface here, as we would say in the UK, getting right down to the sort of interface. So today it's MMU, Manchester Metropolitan University's team. Well, it's not just that institution. I'll let you maybe introduce yourselves in a minute. But it was one of the papers that was part of the special journal issue that we published at the beginning of this year, trying to collect some of the practice and the experience and the cases, if you like, from having gone through emergency transition teaching over the pandemic period in design. So I'll maybe just hand over to you, John. Just before I do that, the next feature session is going to be in September. I was looking at the dates earlier, and James, I haven't confirmed the date with you, so maybe better not say a date until I send you and make sure that you and right. Okay, I'll maybe not do that. It will be in September. It'll be roughly round about this sort of time in the month in September, and hopefully James Carazzo and Leila will be presenting some of their work. That's James furiously writing that down as if he had, remembered it all along. Okay, so John, I think I'll just hand over to you if that's okay, and the team, and just introduce yourselves and to show us what you've been up to.
Grand, thank you, Derek. Cheers. Hello, everyone. My name is John Spruce, and I'll now go to my colleague Sarah Moriarty to say hello.
Good morning. I'm Sarah Moriarty, a colleague of John and Pete.
And then we can go to Pete as well.
I am Pete Thomas. I worked with John last year in MMU, but I'm now the programme leader for graphics and illustration in Liverpool John Moores University.
Great, thanks, Pete. Okay, so we'll crack on. If I, in theory, share my desktop, does that work okay for everyone?
Yeah.
Brill, thank you. I've noticed the flaw of putting there you go, compress that. So that should be okay. I hope everyone can see that. We've got some series of slides to talk through on our journey of riding the new wave, which we are going to explore opportunities for innovation in studio design pedagogy. And as Derek said, this has really taken us from the start of the pandemic period, and then how we've kind of continued to develop our practices through then, and really at a point of questioning now where we're at and where to go next. So I will stop waffling and I'll crack on first. First slide is quite a grotty old slide that I've dug out of our old studio, but it wasn't so long ago and the galaxy's too far away, and this is where we were. So I'll just talk to this slide a little bit. So really that reorientation to the remote teaching that many of us faced due to COVID-19 restrictions took us away from this. It took us away from our established pedagogies, if you like. It took us away from our established ways of teaching in physical studios. Central to this challenge, was the loss of these type of spaces that COVID brought to us, and it really kind of disrupted those communities of practice that we'd all got used to. Certainly we had got used to, and really, the thinking more about what the studio offered or offers. It's well recognised as being a signature pedagogy, a design education. It offers us, a mediated, sticky, social, habitual space for exchanges to happen between staff and students all the time, and really. Delivering remotely through that enforced separation proved to us that through adversity can actually come new insights, particularly when we think about the accelerated use of those emergent technologies to support that distributed working. So really what we then did from our, producing an analog to that physical space in the digital environment, we sort of charted our progress through that COVID period, through that remote teaching period. And from that, in the special issue, we submitted an article. And the takeaways were these three key things on these takeaways here, which I'll just talk to those three bullet points. Specifically, where are we? Let me look, where are we on here? Okay, so yeah, so those three key takeaways really. Visualization and creating mediated social spaces is one of the key things that kind of emerged from our use of digital spaces over that period. The visualization of the design process really enabled us to create sort of digital scaffolds within which we were able to construct workshops, experiment with different modes of thinking, and index design methods in a way that we perhaps hadn't done before. And in that process, students generated a greater sense of awareness of their own learning and their own journeys through the design and creative process, we felt. The second one is about fostering habits and routines to make that experience a communal one. The students worked sort of independently and collaboratively within the digital spaces that reflected the sort of social aspects of the studio space. It changed their kind of nature of engagement with the digital environment, and we felt the papers the papers actually called From Sharing Screens to Sharing Spaces, and we felt that that was the journey that we kind of went on through that time, and it emerged that sense of routine and habitual use. The asynchronous use really of those spaces was evident in several of the projects as they went through the year. And really, beyond the use of the sort of the Miro boards, beyond those kind of the taught sessions, became a real positive sort of sense of exchange. And then finally, the kind of ability or the enabling of autonomy and ownership to make those experiences more sticky. The ownership within those Miro board spaces developed over each of the projects as the familiarity grew, and utilize the elasticity of those digital spaces to kind of create an accessible environment that really started to mimic the use of the physical studio space. And key for us was that it was creating liminal spaces for students to share those ideas and discuss and develop within those kind of like those opportunities for sticky exchanges. Those are the kind of key takeaways from our paper. So really, at the end of that period, which is kind of last summer, I guess, fast forward to September 2021, where the majority of UK institutions adopted a return to campus. But it was clear that some of those more pragmatic approaches to teaching that we'd adopted through necessity could hold a real lasting value beyond those crisis modes of teaching. And certainly for us, it suggested some real benefits in continued use and the integration of that online delivery. So over the past year, we've been prototyping some augmented and blended approaches within the delivery of our programs in both Liverpool and Manchester. So Sarah, would you like to talk to your slides on this?
Yes, absolutely. So if we're kind of thinking about the prototype, then what I'm going to talk about is what the prototype has revealed over the last academic year. So this first slide is about framing, planning and recapping. So I found in the modules that I was teaching that I was able to plan, and this slide shows sort of a tutor-led content timeline of the design process. This is for level 4. So this is for new students who have had a year in lockdown, missed a year of A-level, come in, and actually we found that we were very much having to kind of frame the design process for them. And I thought it was better to show it as a flat image, and that we could build on to sort of show the double diamond that we used, but also the tools and methods within that double diamond that we're looking at as well. So this visual shows an entire project. It also it communicates new information to the students week by week, sometimes day by day. It directs the students to information that they need to refer to and use within their projects. We had quite a lot of absences through COVID and just through them getting used to being in L4. And so what we found was actually having Miro to refer to actually make connections between missed studio sessions, perhaps missed workshops. It was really good to have that image to refer to, so we could actually just zoom in and zoom out so they could make the connections even if they'd missed a session. We do have kind of formal information on different platforms, for example, Moodle. So we will talk about this in later slides, but I found it better for their learning to try and extract key bits of information to have in front of them all the time on Miro, to sort of like try to reduce the confusion trying to access different platforms to get the information. And so you can see from this slide here as well, there is some student work on here, but as this was the first project in L4, we very much it was about the design process, and there's some collaborative stuff here, but it becomes more collaborative as we went through the year.
Sarah,
Okay,
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Could I ask a quick question? It's
yes.
with respect to Tobias's question in the text. I'll be interested to know too. It's asking if the diagram, is it an image of an aggregate of weekly student content?
So what we've got here is, if you start from the kind of far left-hand side, it's the information of the actual structure of the unit. There is student work in here, the student primary research you can see at the bottom, and also there's a timeline at the top, which we ask the students to complete and then drag a screen grab of that to put into their submission at the end, which is a portfolio shot. So there's not lots of student work on here. It's mostly tutor-led content.
Okay, thanks very much. That's interesting.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Going to say next slide, please, John. Thank you. So this is a very different feeling diagram, I think. This is of after Christmas, an international project with a university in India, MIT ID. And so we were using Teams and Miro as a platform for sharing our process and sharing the work that we were producing during the project. So it was really trying to make our structure and our approach to design transparent to our Indian cohort, our Indian collaborators. And so this slide shows information being uploaded both from India and also from MMU at the same time. So we had these review sessions where information was being uploaded and talked about via Teams. This is very much more student-led. What the students put on there, therefore, kind of helped us direct what we're going to do in the next session. The questions that were being raised, the questions that needed answering, the transparency, the process. And also what we found very helpful here, there's a little blue box in the middle, and we were also working with Huhtamaki, a big global packaging company, and the students were able to post questions on there, which Huhtamaki had access to this as well. So they could kind of have that lovely sort of asynchronous chat and update and kind of investigations with in between the fortnightly review times. So you can see there's a lot more going on here in terms of the work being produced, and the interactions that were going on with the students during these reviews and then away from these reviews in an asynchronous way. Okay, John. This is something that I wanted to put in terms of what I found particularly helpful with Miro, is the idea of what a tutorial is. And within Miro, we can actually create an area where students can see what they're doing, but they can also look left and right to see what their peers are doing. And we can also bring in learning during another peer's tutorial into someone else's tutorial. So it's a really good way of kind of cross-referencing and having an awareness of their learning. They can take quite kind of written approaches like the ones on the top left, but actually the most useful ones are the very visual ones where students bring their content to Miro to discuss and then share with others. I've actually taken one of Pete's images that he shared with us the other day, which I'm going to, if you don't mind, Pete, use within our third year planning for their major project. The idea that the students can actually refer and plan out their written work, and then ask the students in the other columns to comment upon what their approaches to their written work and the area they're going to be looking into, and maybe questions they hadn't thought about. That's a really good way of building up that peer work within Miro. So I'm definitely going to be trying that out as a template, Pete. But yes, it is about, for this particular tutorial idea, it's the idea that it's about not just looking at yourself, it's about seeing what other people are doing and learning from that and applying it to your own process. And finally, this was going back to the thing I raised earlier, which is how students access formal content. I found this extremely helpful. First project, L4, there's a lot of just uncertainty and perhaps lack of self-confidence about how to develop a portfolio and present a portfolio. So I ended up being fairly prescriptive, literally saying, right, you've got 15, 20 slides. These slides link to this part of a learning assessment. This is what I'm going to be assessing. This is the criteria. The criteria linked to the university standards grid, descriptors. And the students were aware that when they were actually putting things in their portfolio, how I was going to mark it, because I'd extracted the formal stuff from Moodle to have alongside the visual plan, should we say. There's a submission checklist. The checklist was also cut down and placed next to the different portfolio boards. And I just found that to actually have key learning slides from PowerPoints that I'd linked to Miro, just as a refresher, a reminder. And the students here as well said that it sort of benefits our learning and helps us visualize different lessons or lectures. So I'm hoping that what they mean by the lessons is what they learned from things and how they were going to apply it to their own work. But certainly this was a successful way of doing it with level 4. I think that's it, John.
Yeah, so I'm just going to pick up on a couple of reflections really before we get into kind of, I guess, posing some questions and using this time with you to kind of really think about what the next steps are, and I think between the three of us, I'm probably wearing the metaphorical hat of like doom in terms of I have some reservations, but before I get into them, I'll explain what I've done with it this year. And for me, it's been really interesting because I've gone from a year working with John on a product design program where this really saved our teaching, when we weren't able to access studios, into working in a graphic design illustration program where we do have access to studios. And it's quite interesting for me, the difference of using the space and what it affords us to be able to do with a very different cohort in a very different setting. So in this case, this was kind of kicking off a research project, and I re-employed a series of mapping tools like my excitementometer on the left-hand side, which I'd used previously in MMU and been quite effective. And these worked quite well with the graphics and illustration students, and things like a kind of visual pinboard of images to kind of initial responses to the brief. All that kind of stuff worked very well. And we created, so for mapping and aggregating sort of temperature checks, the platform worked very well with the graphics and illustration students in the same way it had with the product students. John, if you just go to the next slide. And then one of the, pleasing sort of things to see was that in the same way as it had happened in Manchester as well, we saw students just run with the platform. And this was a particularly nice example of it. So this is a first year student who's probably going to focus on an illustration pathway. So what you can see on the left-hand side is an example of a page from their sketchbook. So it's a highly experimental student, in this case working on a project that was all about doing drawings, but had started in a research context. What was fantastic in the work that they presented at the end, because these are basically screen grabs from their final presentation. We gave them kind of 20 slides to tell us the story of their project. And some of those slides were these Miro grabs. So on the right-hand side, they were using Miro independently. I'd started off in that space, but we didn't use it a lot. They'd chosen to carry on using it. They'd structured their research in it. I love the fact they were making, they were actually using it to make links between different pieces of information. And then the fact that it afforded them the opportunity just to kind of screen grab it and put that into their presentation to show the kind of development. And to me, this contrast between the two things is really important, because what we're seeing is this relationship between these physical sketchbooks and this physical experimentation, and then this highly visual way of seeing them thinking and developing with their research. So that was really pleasing to see that they'd taken to that. And then if we just go on to the next slide, John. And then this is just a grab of, I had to do a talk within the institution just about the kind of shift to blended learning, or what we'd now probably call hybrid. And it flagged up a series of concerns that we'll maybe go into in a little bit more depth later. But there are some ongoing concerns around how we do this, and particularly how we do it in within a kind of a physical art school environment. So there are issues around kind of actually requiring hardware equipment in the same way that we need it for doing like team stuff every day and things like that, second screens. there are some barriers for disadvantaged students, particularly with Miro around screen size. So, I mean, it's great for me. I've got 2 monitors and one of them is really big, but some of our kids will be trying to do this off a phone, and that's not going to work. So and likewise, when we when you start to get into using touch screens with it as opposed to using mice and things like that, it raises all sorts of issues, specifically with Miro. There is issues, in terms of the way a lot of the teaching that I've done with Miro over the last 2 years has been around theory modules. And whilst we've seen a kind of some real benefits that we highlighted in the paper around the way that it visualizes design processes and kind of creates a better understanding in a way of the kind of structure underpinning the design approach, there are definitely issues with increasing the amount of time that we spend online and in online environments, as opposed to actually sitting down and talking to each other face to face. So in that context, our kind of traditional studio culture has been eroded by this blended approach. Whilst we can see lots of benefits of it, we are losing something from our traditional approach as well. And there's this kind of constant uncertainty, both between the students. I'm also seeing this at the moment with trying to organize staff meetings, because we use Miro quite a lot with our staff planning as well now. But there's this ongoing question about what's in person, what's digital, what's in the Miro space, what's in another space, and sort of managing these expectations and managing that uncertainty of what thing takes place in what space and what's the best space for what thing is a real issue. So, when John sort of presented this title to Sarah and I, the kind of riding the wave, it actually felt like it really clarified some of the uncertainty that I feel, because I kind of feel like we're just on the edge of falling off that surfboard into the choppy water, because essentially we're using a piece of software in my institution. We're using a piece of software that kind of sits outside the boundaries of what the IT department's prepared to support. I'd probably get told off if people knew how much I've been using Miro. And the way that we're using it, it's still very experimental and trying to determine what's actually the best practice. So we're kind of at this very uncomfortable point in terms of trying to work out where we move to from now. So I'm hoping you're all going to resolve that for me in this conversation.
Thanks. Brilliant, Pete. So, as Pete just said, riding the new wave. We are riding the new wave, or we've got the opportunity to ride the new wave. Undoubtedly, the last 2 years has changed not only our ability or how we teach, but it's also changed how students learn. And I think that's the key thing. It usefully presents tutors with an expanded set of tools. It also provides students with more ways to engage in learning. And for us, that really affords us more opportunity for more critical pedagogies to be explored. That's my attempt at visualizing that wave in terms of that the habits have changed, the tools have changed, the choices have changed, and how we ride this wave now with those things is really crucial, I think, to the next stage of where we develop Design Studio. So 3 key questions that we thought we'd ask everybody, or we thought we'd throw out there, are there. I think that they're all our three major concerns, aren't they? Pete, would you like to speak to your one first?
Yes, I will. So I was busy typing to try and answer Tobias's question as well, but I shall jump into this. Yeah, so for me, like the biggest issue we've got is like I feel very strongly that the benefits that I've got out of using Miro, some specific benefits of it, whether it's Miro or whether it's another platform similar to it, are really, really valuable. So this kind of sense of visualizing process, the permanence of it, the fact that the post-it notes don't fall off the wall, which sounds ridiculous, but is incredibly useful. and creating this idea of a kind of asynchronous learning environment that students can kind of dip in and dip back out of. So the clearest example for me is just thinking about the difference in how I would previously have run a workshop in the studio, and that at the end of the day, probably those materials wouldn't have stayed up for very long on the wall for one reason or another. Whereas now there's just this opportunity for that space to be revisited asynchronously. Students who hadn't got it can go back to it. Students who need to repeat it can go back to it. Students can break out their own space around it. The content can be duplicated. There's all these things that feel really, really valuable. So what I want to understand is, how do we bring them into the studio? Because what I've experienced this year is that when we've started to use this, and also when we've used it for staff things as well, is that I end up with a room of people who are all individually looking at computers. Now, that's not the kind of studio environment I want to work in. I want a studio environment where we're talking to each other and we're working, potentially across different platforms and different media, but one that isn't requiring us to spend more and more time feeling like we're spending more and more time online, and potentially spending more time on platforms that can actually take us in different distractions. So when we're kind of basically making our students use their phones, their laptops, their tablets to access increasing amounts of information, I have a slight fear that we're losing something that we gain from our physical studio environment and the way that we communicate to each other. I think there's a real challenge. Like I said, we kind of sit outside of the supported IT model within the institution. And I think there's not many people who understand what we're actually doing with the technology. So there's a question, if we are going to commit to creating digital studios, what does that mean in terms of like an IT budget spend, and in terms of how you actually equip those students with the kind of Wi-Fi to deal with it, with the screens that the students can interact on collectively rather than working on their own computers. But also the kind of culture that we want, to what degree is that culture become a digital one first? I'm kind of slightly nervous that there's what I see happening in education at the moment, and particularly off the back of the lockdowns, is that there's a sort of stealth culture change through IT implementation. We were chatting before this call went live about the difference between using Zoom and Teams. But what you see is that decisions start to get made based on what software can do, rather than what's actually the right thing to the right method of teaching. So those things I'm very nervous about, really, and would like to hear other people's thoughts on in a minute.
Cool. Sarah, do you want to just mention that middle one?
So it's kind of building on what Pete was saying about the kind of the pedagogy of all this. I'm interested in how we understand learners and how they want to access information. We don't print out, I think we do print out module handbooks to start with, or unit handbooks to start with. I don't think they're probably ever referred to. It's just a stack of paper in the studio. So we are relying on students to access important stuff about the unit online. And as I showed in that earlier slide, I found the most effective way is actually you take the important bits and you put it on the main bit, which you're sharing with your students every time you see them. So they have that language there in front of them, the formal language in front of them, whilst you're talking to them about a creative process, so they can understand and realize what I'm assessing them on, and also kind of embrace that and really work towards that. However, we are, in doing so, we are assuming that that's how they want to learn. And it takes me back to the notion of understand the differentiation of our learners. I think we all agree here, Pete and John and I, that there's several years ago, decades ago, there was an expectation that your students arrived in front of you with a certain set of design skills, a certain, maybe even a foundation chucked in there, where they've actually had a go at understanding art, design and process and things like that. And now we're getting students on the back of lockdown who really are from such differing backgrounds and such abilities to design, that actually one size fits all in terms of how you deliver a brief and what you do in a project isn't working. It really isn't working. It particularly didn't work for our level 4. So we were kind of trying to use Miro and our studio practice to kind of sweep them all through this and try and help them and ride this wave, so to use John's description or title of this. But actually what it fundamentally brings us back to is how can we better understand the sort of differentiation and the different ways in which we need to tackle and embrace and understand and nurture these learners, and in which parts of the online platform does that work and which parts of the studio practice does that work. And I think I've kind of come to the kind of, it's because I've worked in secondary education as well, where you talked a lot about differentiation. In fact, most planning was about that. That's I never sort of we do plan for that within how we deliver, but I think we have to do it more, and I'm wanting Miro to be able to support that, but I don't want it to overtake it if it's not the right thing to do. So I think it's critical pedagogy is what we'll talk about here, how that's changing, how we can really help our learners in lots of different ways, but in sometimes quite prescriptive ways and sometimes less prescriptive ways. And I guess it's just that kind of, it's that wave thing again, isn't it? How much should we do? How little should we do? When do we let go? When do we let go of the armbands? It's all that.
It's a little, just jumping in there. I mean, it's very much what I was talking about in terms of us testing all this out and not really having the answer. So, you know, in terms of formal content at the moment, everybody's probably using a system like Blackboard or Moodle or Canvas or whatever within the institutions to manage information. I mean, well, I know from being at MMU and John Moore's, like our own websites are absolutely terrible at communicating institutional information to students. And then we have like these paper handouts that we do in studio. And now we have another platform where we put content. So it's like, there's just that tension of where do you go? Where are you expected to put it and where do you go to find it?
Absolutely. Thanks, Pete. And then my last one was just about behavior, really, and what we've witnessed over the last 12 months is a real shift in behavior in students, almost kind of having a different sense of, Pete used the word codified the other day. So there's a codified and an understood way of behaving in physical space, in physical studio space, and that is as yet uncodified and undefined for us, certainly in the digital spaces. And a good example of that would be the crit and the perception of the crit and how how students handle the crit in a digital space versus a physical space. And there's the experience of spending time in front of screen over the COVID period has that legacy now, and I think they're coming to the studio and they come online with different expectations and with different senses of what that means and what the values and what the benefits are. And I think there's a lot of discussion to be had there around what that might be and how can we better understand that, really. I will leave it there and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, John. Holy crap, where do we start? It's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'll put a link to John's paper in the text chat. If you scroll up, you'll find it. It's well worth reading. But I think what's more rich, or what is richer, sorry, is just the discussion, is just the way that you've presented it. There was a lot of details that I hadn't even kind of fully picked up on from the paper in there. I'm just going to pull out, while people are thinking of questions and what they might want to ask John and the team first. Is it okay to ask a few questions just of something that you presented before we maybe come to your questions as well, John? Would that be okay? Because there's so much that was contained in there. While people are thinking of questions, I'd just like to draw everybody's attention to two fantastic quotes. The first one was sticky exchanges. John, I don't know if you realised that that's actually what came out of your mouth. And the metaphorical hat of doom. I love this. I want one of those. I absolutely want one of those, and I'm going to wear it every single day. So thank you very much for those. I'll maybe just open out. I've got loads of questions, but I really don't want to dominate the discussion. I'm also coming from a completely different perspective. We don't have any choice. We don't have physical studios anyway to start with. So I'll be coming at it from a different perspective as well. So I'm happy just to open it out to anybody else who wanted to jump in immediately.
I was just going to respond to that, to the fact that you don't have physical studios, because interestingly, I was chatting to one of our external examiners, and they're responsible for a program at the moment which is entirely delivered online. And that conversation was just really fascinating in terms of how this conversation changes. So I think it's really important that, I guess, a lot of what we're talking about is because we're trying to root it in this, because where the paper started out from was, how does this reflect our traditional studio model, and how does it change it, and how does it impact on it? And that's very much what's in the back of our heads, but it's a very different conversation when you've got students going into different environments, I think.
Completely agree, Peter. And again, it's almost the position that you start from. You know, it's maybe to push the wave analogy. You know, it is whether you've started off on a surfboard or are being dragged into the sea by a shark. They're really bad. But you know what I mean? Like, extend the metaphor until it breaks. It really does depend what your starting position was. And during the pandemic, our constant refrain was, we've been doing this for 50 years. We put millions of pounds into our online learning spaces. You've got 3 days to create something. What do you think is going to happen here? So yeah, you need to be comparing apples to apples. But sorry, I don't want to dominate the, but it'd be good to catch up on that sometime as well, Peter, because some of your reflections were really interesting and apposite in that. James, did you want to go first?
I'm happy to throw one in. Thank you all. I mean, it was a really good account that of a lot of things I recognised in our experiences of using Miro over those same periods, both the COVID period and then the kind of transition back to space period, and the questions you're asking about how it works in that kind of in a blended sort of version of things. I was coming here today to get answers to those questions myself as well. So you know, maybe we'll get there eventually. But I've got a number of questions, but I'm going to ask one, and it's just on something you mentioned in passing quite earlier on. You mentioned about the idea, and I think this was the use of Miro boards when we were in full pandemic mode here. You mentioned around the Miro spaces or the Miro boards themselves as creating liminal spaces. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about
that. I mean, John, do you want to?
That's a Johnism, that. John, that's yours.
I was just going to say, we there was a few things when we were writing the paper that really came out, and kind of like some of that liminality and the kind of stickiness was some of the most interesting stuff to me. And there was a sense like I think in the paper there's some quotes which I wish I could just have them to hand, but there was this idea of like how that studio environment creates this kind of space which is occasional, and you get serendipity in there, and tutors will wander in and wander past, and you can glance over somebody's head and see something that's pinned up on the wall behind. There's this sense of kind of like it being this bigger thing than just the sum of a student sitting at a desk. And for me, there's a kind of like a liminality in the Miro space that students can just kind of go in there and access it again and serendipitously meet up with another student, or arrange to meet a group and kind of go to a corner of the page and create their own space again. And so it has this kind of like in-betweenness in terms of accessing it asynchronously between taught content, but also this kind of serendipitous nature to it. John, you might have a better take on that.
Not at all. No, that's great. It's that ability to swim around, isn't it? Like the studio offers you that ability to swim around, and I know there's positives and negatives to studio culture, but the ability to find spaces, to find things, to explore in your own time. And, you know, almost like if you think about design tools and design methods, you know, I sometimes think about, I'm a big believer in design process and visualizing the design process, and really giving students call it a scaffolding or call it a handrail to navigate those spaces, but you know, within that quite perhaps linear way of thinking about it, there's also the opportunity to kind of switch and traverse and stuff like that, and find things that you wouldn't automatically be looking for, but you come across them. And that's that relationship between the physical studio space that you find, oh, didn't expect to see that here today, and then creating those Miro boards that enabled a similar type of serendipitous exchange or the navigation of that space in a really interesting way.
I think that's a really important point. I think to stress it again, I mean, we spend a lot of time trying to create those kind of liminal spaces in an online setting at the Open University, and we have done for a long time. The first step is to actually recognise, make visible, as we would say in the studio projects team, properties team, what it is in studio that you're actually talking about in the first place. I mean, it's great to hear the language already in terms of liminality, sticky exchanges. These kind of conceptual metaphors are actually really quite important. Because sometimes we just use studio and assume that it does all the work that we need it to do, and then designers come out the end. We don't necessarily unpick our own pedagogical practices. I think it's hyper important that we are actually more articulate and much more responsive about what it is we value in studio. And then, as you say, Peter, we take that thing into the space and say, what tools will deliver this to us or support our delivery or maintaining of that concept? And we spend a lot of time trying to work with concepts and conceptual gestalts as opposed to technical specifications. It's difficult, really difficult when you're in a technocratic university. And to extend the wave metaphor, there's a whole bunch of rocks over on the right-hand side there. And I think you were right, Peter. It's not just which platforms that we're going to use. It's a whole bunch of technocratic jaggy rocks under the surface that are probably going to rip the crap out of the bottom of our dinghy here. In the short to medium term. So it'll be interesting to see how we respond to that. Sorry, Peter, Robert, who you want to jump in on that as well?
Okay, so we've used Miro pretty extensively in the small number of design modules that we've been teaching over the last 2 years. I think we've been using it, and it's been very, very successful for many of the reasons I'm hearing here. But actually, you just reminded me that a key thing that we found is, from our perspective, the importance of getting the structures right, getting that scaffolding. And I can see, the examples you've shown that it does that really well. But also another thing, which is this serendipitous use, and we've seen students, really go for it and really get excited by the board and start building stuff all over the place. Actually making sure that they understand that they have a responsibility when they're creating stuff in this kind of almost infinite space of the Miro board, that they have a responsibility to structure things and make it accessible for each other, for the rest of the class, and to think about how they're doing that. Now, that's actually been a really positive thing for them to do. So getting them to reflect upon how they're designing their interactions and what they're doing in the Miro boards and making them usable for each other. Not all of the students did well at that, so you can see some real messes, but that's a good thing. So we're then able to talk to them about it and actually use that as a learning opportunity, which has been, really great. But it's a new world for us all, because it is this kind of infinite expandable space. It's not like a traditional whiteboard. People feel more freedom, which is a great thing to see. That's fantastic. There's one other point I'll make before I shut up, though, and that is about this thing. So we're starting from scratch. We don't have design school or design programs at all. And one thing I don't have, designing new undergraduate degree programs right now, one thing I don't have, I'm not likely to get, is access to studio spaces. And I thought this was a really bad thing. I thought we were going that I was going to have to go for a big battle with the university and get some physical space, which is really, really hard. Then actually I went out into the kinds of industries and fields and design professionals that we're thinking about, we're working with, and talked to them about it. They don't use design studios anymore. They're out in the field. They're at home, they're all over the place, they're working with people internationally. So I'm kind of now thinking, well, maybe it's a good thing that we're not going to get studio, and we're going to do stuff in a much more ad hoc way. We're going to use an entire building as our canvas, and possibly entire campus and beyond. All of that kind of stitched together using the digital tools, which will be Miro to start with, but I also see that lots of other tech companies like Microsoft and Apple are making Miro-like platforms now. So it's definitely the future. And it may be the future for the designers that we're developing now. And we want them to live in that world, or at least be able to survive in it.
I wonder if that
Really
touches on
interesting.
one of the-
It's just fascinating.
I wonder if that touches on one of the bigger questions about whether, we know we can do it. We've done it. You're doing it just now, Robert. But the question is, should we be? And I wonder whether we could turn to that in some ways. So, for example, one of the strong examples I would give here would be in architecture. There was a period where just after SketchUp came out, there was a whole bunch of SketchUp buildings that appeared. Buildings that were vertical extrusions of shapes in a 2D plan. The tools that we use absolutely affect the way that we think, absolutely affect. Miro is actually not too bad, but it still has a whole bunch of templates. It still has, believe it or not, it still has a certain bunch of preferences in the way that it's presented. It certainly still has a language and a semantic set of preferences. So I wonder whether that's just one question, but I wonder what other types of question would help us answer the should we question, or are there other relevant concerns or relevant issues, and not just the romantic ones, not just the isn't it a shame that we've lost, or isn't it crap that we have to ... I wonder if there's actually real tangible things that you've learned from your project, Peter, John, or Sarah, excuse me. No, these are really the valuable things that we get from face-to-face that are absolutely, or we haven't found a way to replicate these, or vice versa. I just wondered if there was anything along those lines that you've come across.
I think it's interesting that there's definitely a place and a reason for saying actually we should be encouraging students to be more nomadic, if you like, in their use of space, and get used to meeting in random spaces and being able to almost like turn a coffee table into a studio, and use when I used to work in Liverpool a few years ago now. And I was used to refer to, because we always struggle with studio space. So I was saying the city is your canvas and the city is your studio. And so we would literally use anywhere in the city as a studio space. But
Could I ask
and I
John?
know that's the way that maybe practice may be developed, or design practice may be developing. But the value, like I say, beyond the romantic value of the studio, it's the communal shared learning. It's absolutely essential, and having seen the response, having seen how students have responded this year, and how they've almost forgotten that. They've forgotten how to share space, and they've forgotten how to share learning, and how that has impacted on their results this year, and on the speed of how they work through the curriculum. It certainly made me even more affirmed that actually we do need to use studio space, maybe in different ways, but we still certainly need it.
Yeah, and Tobias in the comments, like Tobias talked about like relational pedagogy, and I was doing an open day just before doing this, and we're really lucky because we have a studio for each of our year groups, dedicated studio space, which is increasingly unusual. And one of the things that affords is like a really close working relationship between staff and students in the space, and the opportunity to really spend time with people and kind of nurse people through quite difficult situations, both personal ones, but obviously within their projects as well. My fear is that there will inevitably be courses that work in a digital only model. So we talked about them before. I think it's Falmouth, isn't it, that are doing the international kind of design programs. And there's brilliant things to celebrate about those approaches, in just the same way there is about the way the OU does stuff. My biggest concern is that what we will see is that we will lose our studio space because there's a perception that we can do this in another way. And what particularly concerns me about it is that, or one of the things that concerns me about it, is that the studio is actually a great leveler. So we have a lot of students from disadvantaged backgrounds who work in our studio. It was really difficult working with them in the first lockdown, when some of them were sharing houses with extended families, grandparents, younger brothers and sisters, and or potentially in spaces that they didn't want to have to share, or didn't feel comfortable working in. Whereas one of the benefits of a studio space is actually it gives you a place to practice, to do your practice. There's also this kind of creeping commoditization of what we do. And this, we're increasingly raising the fees for what we do. but at the same time expecting everyone to find the space, the materials, to do it on their own time or in their own time. And this kind of push, there's a sort of push here around like student-centered learning, which sort of translates into people can pick and choose when they do things. But the downside of that is actually we're creating a culture whereby people might work 40-hour weeks and then try and fit in a 40-hour degree at the same time, which, you know, I don't think we should be promoting this kind of behavior. I think there's a really beneficial from a health and a like a sociological and a psychological point of view. There are real benefits to a studio environment.
Yep, James, did you want to jump in on that?
Well, it sort of connects to what Pete said and something that John said earlier on. So if anyone wants to respond directly to what Pete just said, I can sit tight for a moment.
I wouldn't mind just quickly on it, because I completely agree with a lot of what you say, Peter, where that happens in a positive way. I think anybody who's read the recent Bartlett report would also be very conscious of the fact that there's a whole bunch of negative crap that can also be associated with studio. I think where we have good and positive studio practice, it is one of the most incredible things in the world. And I know that I still carry with me a massive romantic attachment to my studio experience, if you like, as a student. But there's also a whole bunch of students who don't have access to those physical spaces, or have a whole bunch of other issues that come with that. So again, what's interesting is that your conception of studio is very much more, it's almost like a socio-political one in some ways. And again, it's these extended ideas of studio that we don't talk about, or that don't get represented at a kind of functional level or a technical level within the university, that this is actually part of the job of work of a studio. If it is to be a leveler, then it has to be a political thing, it has to be a social thing, it has to be an economic thing, it has to do certain other work that doesn't currently get properly described by normal university structures. Once again, it's the tension of the design studio being inside a university, not necessarily being inside either a professional or a design college, if you see what I mean, in the UK. So yeah, there's definitely, I would agree with you, Peter, completely on some of those positive ones, but there's also a whole bunch of negatives that can arise from it. And that's as much our responsibility. And maybe this is also part of riding the wave, that maybe at the crest of the wave, we need to really shout out and say, no, what's really good about this is ... And that's why you taking this away, or that's why it's really good for this particular thing. Anyway, sorry, end rant. I'm sorry. But yeah, I feel you. Sorry, James. Yeah.
Thanks, Derek. No, I mean, I think what I'm going to ask connects to when John talked about studio in relation to community. Pete talked about that notion of practicing and leveling. You've just talked about the socio-political. My question for the authors, I guess, the presenters, is around identities. Yeah, so the development of, often we're developing designerly identities, but I'm using that term quite carefully there. And I'm just asking kind of speculatively whether you noticed any sorts of differences between the kind of locked down COVID Miro version of teaching design, because we're teaching design, they make things, but they're also making themselves, aren't they, at the same time? And then this kind of coming out of that back in the studio, making or shaping or spaces for their identities to develop again. So yeah, sorry, that was a really stupidly long question there. Basically, identities in Miro, identities in physical spaces.
I think so. We were discussing sort of thing the other day, and what was the word that I kept banging on about? I think there's a you can, you know, the anonymity that goes with digital space and social media, and for me there was a sense of anonymity that carried on in those digital spaces that doesn't cut it in a physical space. And what I've noticed this year, especially earlier on in the year, when students were coming back into the studio, there was almost like a hangover of that anonymity and the personas that they developed in the digital space they brought into the studio space. And so it's just this a bit of a strange kind of set of personalities to be dealing with, and that's where that thing of like, it's not the relationship between digital space and physical space, and the expectations of those are different, or it's become different. So I don't know the answer, but yeah.
There was something that we didn't talk about, John, when we were discussing anonymity the other day, but feeds into what James is saying, is if we're talking about kind of personality creation, or, you know, in the context of what we're doing on the program, where ideally at the end of it, students come out with a kind of reasonably formed or nascent idea of who they are as a practitioner. Yeah. That identity formation is stifled through anonymity, isn't it? Because part of what we talk about when we talk about the traditional studio environment is that the creation of that identity is shaped as much by your experience with your tutors and your own practice as by your peers and what's going on around you. So a good example, like Leisha on our third year, who's just graduated, you know, so they'd gone to 2 years of lockdown, those students, in various different ways, a little bit of hybrid at some points in it, but essentially hadn't really used many of the facilities. Probably about halfway through the third year, she just discovered printing, you know, screen printing in particular. I was showing Sarah it yesterday, actually. And that this is her thing now. You know, she just found printmaking and then just became a printmaker. You know, so she was in the workshop all day and kind of experimenting and showing people stuff, you know, culminating in these 4-meter long prints that we've got hanging up in our studio. There's no way that could have happened outside of this kind of environment, like a collaborative environment, an environment where you had those kind of facilities. But I suspect that this conversation we're having flags up a kind of this bigger issue about the kind of like parameters of design and the different types of design and the kind of the situation or the platforms that you need to deliver different types of design are just radically different, aren't they?
I would also just add to that we did talk the other day about, we were reflecting on how many crits and pinups we'd had over the last year, and we really hadn't had as many as we would normally have. And actually the ones that we did have were on Miro. There were some very reluctant students to actually kind of show and actually kind of record where they were at that particular moment in time, because although the benefit of Miro is to have this kind of archive of our creative process, for a lot of students, once they've shown that sketch to someone, they never want anyone to ever see it again, because the next one you're going to see will be better or more resolved or more refined. And that really, I was like, you know, I kind of got frustrated with students who just didn't want to kind of comply, in inverted commas, with an online version, particularly when we're doing the international project. But standing back and reflecting on that, they were the students that very much stuck to the sketchbooks and didn't really want to, and were doing the protected drawing behavior stuff. And I kind of think, well, we were talking the day about how when you have a pin-up in a studio, everybody naturally joins in. There's part of it, isn't it? That's that expectation. And I think that we were maybe starting to tentatively say, well, maybe pin-ups on Miro don't work if it's in a UK setting, as well as an actual physical one would work. But how else would we do that on an international, working with international students? And maybe it's less about, I don't know, it's trying to kind of carry it through where you can still communicate your ideas, but again, nurturing, as people say, nurturing, it is about really supporting people in that sort of environment, isn't it? A pin-up and a critique. And it definitely didn't work as well on Miro as it did in the studio. So why were we doing more on Miro and less in the studio?
Okay, that's interesting. I wonder whether that touches on like the way that we communicate what the crit is. And again, as designers, we are still fantastically wedded to the final image or the successful thing, not the 99% of, you know, 4 tons of paper. You know, we don't show that. Is that the idea, James, of the hidden stuff that Farias and Wilkie talk about of studio? James's point in the chat, there was something that I did want to pick up on just quickly. Sorry, Robert, but I think this is actually incredibly important, particularly in your work, Sarah, the way that you presented what was happening there. We do a lot of this at the Open University as well, but I don't think as successfully or as socially as you demonstrated in that Miro space. This is the idea that as you're collecting together students' work, and I'm guessing there's a contingency there, that those diamonds, the different shapes, if you like, of the diamonds or the different sizes, they are contingent. Okay, that's like based on what was happening, as well as the structure of the negotiated curriculum. And it's that idea of negotiated curriculum, which is actually quite important in studio. Colin Gray writes about this as well. It's the idea that students don't know what they're doing, but that's the point. But you need to give them something, but you don't need to give them too much, but you need to give them enough, but you don't, not too. So it's that constant negotiation of not enough. And it seems to me that in that Miro board, you saw a visible, tangible representation of what happens in studio caught, if you like, in moments in time. Now, that's something you don't normally get to see. You alluded to that as well, I think, Peter, as well, to this idea of it capturing these things. So this meta stuff, this meta information, one, it seems to have been pedagogically useful, but two, it's potentially useful in terms of like talk back to the subject or to the domain. And this is where I suppose there are some design education theorists who would argue that education is actually one of the few spaces where you get the chance to see the visibility of this stuff as truth, not just as representation of what designers say it is or what we talk about. Do you think is there something deeper and much more valuable about this aspect of it? I mean, have you given thought to what was actually represented on those boards as like a thing? Is this something that we could be making more use of or more value of?
Just to jump in, John, before you want to answer this, what I've found in reflection this week, my colleague is teaching the module which I showed you before, and I'm not doing it again this coming year. And I couldn't remember, I'd forgotten that we'd done so much stuff. And I think you know, you're just in the moment, aren't you? You're like, right, go, go, go. And I thought, my God, we did a lot of stuff here, didn't we? Because we'd photographed it, we'd upload it. It was an archive of the students' work. Then stuff that they'd done, which we hadn't expected, we put on there as a learning thing. So they were driving the details they were creating, which we weren't expecting. That was driving a set of tools that we thought they should try the following week for those people who hadn't tried it yet. And we captured all of that. And actually, it was just really satisfying, should we say, and also quite positive to go, look, it's not like, oh, here's the unit handbook, you know, jog on. It was like, here's the Miro board. And I'm like, wow, oh, that's interesting. And so that's a new thing I hadn't even expected to come from this, is that the kind of pleasure in revisiting the archive and reflecting on the archive. And some stuff just didn't work and we'd remove that. But actually, it was great to give them that amount of content to explore.
Also the rationality, I mean, that's what really struck me about that, Sarah. That's a really powerful piece of relationality to say, look, these learning outcomes or this rubric or whatever it is, it's not just an abstract concept that sits independently of. When you put it spatially, you know, when you put it side by side, even the size of it in relation to the other object. I know it sounds really trivial. Maybe I'm making too much of it as a very visually oriented designer. What can I say? I'm super.
We talk about hierarchy all the time, though, don't we?
Yeah.
We talk about it all the time.
We don't mean it, yeah.
And I'm a real believer in the power of assessment. It shouldn't be scary. It should be in the language. It should be in the way we describe stuff all the time. They should be like looking at it and go, right, these are the words they use in these descriptors. How can I get there? What do these really kind of, well, we find in our art school, the kind of the vagueness of the word. How can we extract that word and make it meaningful for the students so they're actually onto it and excited by it, as opposed to, oh God, we've got to have it assessed at the end.
This is a good, sorry, so I was just going to say, this is a good example of where the lack of rules or structure, like the ambiguity of where we're in, like particularly if you think about visual representation of work produced during a module. It's really difficult, isn't it? Because I had students, when we were testing this out last year, I had students uploading presentations, but, you know, as PDFs, where you only see one slide on the screen, but nested in depth, if you like, is another 30 slides behind it. Whereas you've got somebody beside them who's put all those 30 slides out side by side in this flat hierarchy. And without us having that clarity about what should be flat and what has depth, it's really hard to compare one thing to another thing without knowing the rules of the game. So it's like, there's a degree of us kind of just making it up as we're going along, which is that treacherousness of what we're doing at the moment. Yep,
absolutely. Sorry, I know that Robert's been patiently waiting. I'm conscious of the fact that we're 5 past already, but Robert, did you want to ask a question? Or?
Oh, my mic's on, isn't it? So just to say, I just posted some photos of one of our workshops there. You can look at them later. There'll be a photo there of us in a space doing our kind of, physical haptic stuff together in a physical space. You'll see a giant whiteboard, electronic whiteboard. I think it's brilliant and really high quality piece of equipment behind there. And so we've got stuff as usual, sticky notes and all that kind of stuff going on, and activities. So I'm there photographing everything we're doing and live archiving that into the Miro board on the giant electronic whiteboard, with students coming up and doing stuff on the electronic whiteboard as well. So we've got a record of this whole thing that the students can then look at and reflect on. So we're using it in a really integrated way. And that's really important, because I could see what was going on there. I was modeling the use of the electronic tool in a way in which is completely integrated with the physical space. And then the students really got into Miro and using it in a kind of very kind of interpersonal way, in a very collaborative way later on. And that was reflected in the work they produced.
Have you got anybody like looking at that, Robert, at all? Is anybody like doing a proper bit of ethnography and properly?
I think we will this time, because
I'm loving. It's great.
Yeah,
it's a lovely mix of physical and digital.
So this is what I was wondering, because we've been
Yeah.
using the words hybrid and blended, and you mentioned integrated there. I could give you 20 ways in which that isn't any of those things as well. I wonder that we're just throwing some of these terms roundabout. I think a very useful follow-up to this type of discussion would be to actually get some people together to really unpick what we're meaning by these sorts of terms, like what is, and I mean it as the way you said it, Peter. It was really interesting to hear you say this earlier, in the specific context of art and design education, because blended and hybrid learning have got very technical definitions from where I come from, the Open University, and they're all explicitly set out, but they do not relate to art and design education. There's certain places where it breaks down, and it's usually in that moment of contingency, that moment of experiential learning, or of social constructivist, particularly social constructivist learning. That's where it completely breaks down. And I think that what we know a lot more about is that kind of, and I think that'll be an interesting thing to explore, those kind of levels, if you like, of what we're talking about, of blendedness, because it's more than time, it's more than space, it's more than presence, it's more than conceptual. As we've seen, we've looked at about 17 different dimensions of change, if you like, in studio today, just today. Sorry, that's another rant. I'm really sorry. Tobias, I really did want to come back to you on the relational pedagogy thing, but we're really struck. I'm so sorry. We've got it. This is your fault, John, right? What did I say? Keep it really simple and boring, you know, and you came up with all this interesting stuff.
Nothing to do with me. It's your excitement that carries us through.
I doubt it very much. Yeah, I really feel that there is actually a load of stuff that does actually need to get followed up on here. I'll maybe give you a shout, John, about that to see, because there is, well, the bottom line is there is some important stuff here, and we should be getting this down somewhere, and not just in a recording and not just in a discussion somehow, just in case the worst happens. I'm going to have to end it there, everyone. I'm very conscious that it's gone over time. I'm so sorry for that. My deepest apologies. It's testament to how interesting it was. John, thank you very much. Sarah, absolutely superb. And Peter, thank you very much for your thoughtfulness in this. I'll end the recording here. But yeah, thank you very much once again. The next event in September, I'll post dates for it as soon as we confirm them with James, and I hope to see you then. Okay, thank you all very much.